My name is Robert Harmon. I'm 65 years old, a retired CPA, and 3 weeks ago my son's wife looked me dead in the eyes and told me the attic was perfectly livable for a man my age. She said it with a smile. She said it like she was doing me a favor. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had already called my attorney the morning before. What they didn't know was that somewhere inside the 40-page gift agreement they had signed and never bothered to read, there was a single paragraph that was about to change everything. A reversion clause. My old colleague Frank used to call it the nuclear option. I called it common sense, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a retired accountant ends up sleeping under exposed rafters in his own son's house, and how that same accountant, the one they called paranoid, the one they laughed at for insisting on paperwork, ended up with every last thing they thought they'd taken from him. It started the way these things always do, with a dinner that felt just slightly wrong. My wife Carol passed 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I was holding her hand when she went. And I can tell you that there is nothing in this world that prepares you for the silence that follows. Our house in Raleigh, the one we'd lived in for 22 years, the one where my son Daniel grew up, the one where Carol had her garden and her reading chair and her absolute insistence that we never eat dinner without real plates, not paper. That house became something I couldn't recognize anymore. Every room held a version of her I'd never see again. I couldn't stay. Daniel called 6 weeks after the funeral. He and his wife Vanessa lived in Nashville, a 4-bedroom house they'd stretched themselves thin to buy 2 years earlier. He sounded warm on the phone, genuinely warm, the way he used to sound before Vanessa rearranged the furniture of his personality. "Dad," he said, "you shouldn't be alone up there. You should be near family." He said the word family the way people say it when they mean it. And I believed him, because he was my son. And I was tired, and I missed Carol so much, it felt like a physical weight on my chest every single morning. The plan they presented made sense, on the surface. Sell the Raleigh house, contribute the proceeds to a larger property in Nashville, and we'd all live together. I'd have the ground floor master suite, my non-negotiable, the thing I asked for because of my hip replacement 2 years ago, and the fact that pull-down attic stairs and steep staircases are not something a man with a titanium hip joint approaches casually. Daniel knew this. He nodded seriously when I explained it. "Of course, Dad, the ground floor room is yours. That's the whole point." The Raleigh house sold for $940,000. I kept enough to cover my living expenses and contributed $800,000 to the Nashville property, a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac in Brentwood, listed at just under $1.4 million. Daniel and Vanessa covered the rest with a mortgage. I had my attorney Frank Delgado draw up a gift agreement, a proper one, with the reversion clause I'd always used in trust planning for my clients. Frank raised an eyebrow. "For your own son, Robert?" I told him what I'd told every client who asked the same question. Documentation isn't distrust, it's dignity. He put it in. The ground floor suite was everything I needed. It had its own bathroom with a walk-in shower I could use safely, French doors that opened onto the back patio where I'd already started planning a small container garden, Carol's kind of garden. It was mine. It was in the agreement. It was, I thought, settled. I should have known better. Settled is a word that means something different to an accountant than it does to a woman like Vanessa. She's 36, my daughter-in-law, and she carries her ambition the way some people carry perfume. You know, she's been in the room long after she's left it. She works in marketing, or she used to. By the time I moved to Nashville, she had quit her job to run what she called her personal brand consulting business from home. I never fully understood what that meant. I understood the deliveries, though, the packages that arrived daily. The labels I recognized even at 65 Nordstrom, Revolve, Net-a-Porter. I understood that Daniel, a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, was not making the kind of money that explained what was coming in through that front door. The dinner where it started was a Tuesday in October. Vanessa had made pasta, and she was being attentive and cheerful in that particular way of hers that I had learned meant she wanted something. She refilled my water without being asked. She asked about my hip. She called me Robert, which she always did. Never Dad, just Robert. As though we were colleagues at a firm neither of us particularly liked. She put her fork down halfway through the meal and looked at Daniel with the kind of pointed look that means the conversation has already been decided, and this is just the performance of it. Daniel cleared his throat. Dad, he said, not meeting my eyes. We've been thinking about the room situation. I set my own fork down. The room situation? I repeated. Vanessa jumped in, smooth and immediate, the way a lawyer objects before the other side finishes their sentence. It's just that with the business growing, she said, I really need a dedicated professional space. Clients expect a certain standard. Video calls, equipment, backdrops. She waved a hand as though the details were beneath, explaining, Your room, Robert and I want you to understand, this is coming from a place of love. Your room is the only space on the ground floor that has the natural light my setup needs. I looked at her. There are 4 other bedrooms in this house, I said. She gave a patient smile, the kind reserved for people who are being deliberately slow. The 2 rooms upstairs are already set up, she said. One is our guest room. The other has all our storage, the gym equipment. It would take months to reorganize. And the 4th bedroom is on the split-level landing, you know yourself. Those stairs are awkward, which left the attic. I already knew where this was going. Daniel finally looked up. It's actually a really nice space, Dad. We had it insulated last year. There's a window. We could put in a proper bed, get you a space heater. I want to be clear about something, because the comment sections of the internet like to ask why the father didn't just take a different room. The attic of that house is accessed by a pull-down folding staircase. Narrow, steep, no railing on the right side. For a man with a hip replacement, a man whose orthopedic surgeon had put in writing that he should avoid uneven or unstable stair surfaces, that attic was not a room. It was a liability, and I told them so, calmly, precisely, the way I'd told clients for 35 years that the numbers don't change because you want them to. Vanessa's smile didn't waver. She said, Lots of people manage just fine with Daniel, I said, cutting through her. I want to talk to you. Alone. She didn't like that. Her eyes moved to him, that wordless commanding look, and I watched my son make his choice in real time. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at his pasta. Dad, she's right that the attic is probably the most practical, and that was the moment. That was the moment I understood that the conversation I was having was not really with my son. My son was already gone somewhere, I couldn't see him clearly. I nodded. I said I needed to think about it. They seemed satisfied with that. Vanessa refreshed my water again. I lay in my ground floor suite, the one Carol would have loved, and I stared at the ceiling and I felt the first real cold clarity I'd had since her funeral. Something was wrong. Not just the room situation. Something underneath it. I started paying attention the way I'd been trained to pay attention, which is to say, I started looking at the numbers. I am a retired CPA, 35 years of forensic accounting, estate planning, and trust administration. I spent the better part of my career finding the thing people had hidden in plain sight, the transaction that didn't add up, the number slightly out of place. You don't stop seeing that way just because you retire. Vanessa's business, this personal brand consulting, I'd never seen an invoice, never heard her mention a client meeting, never heard her on a work call. What I had seen was the packages. What I had noticed, because I woke early and often walked through the kitchen before 7, was that Daniel left the house by 6:45 and Vanessa didn't emerge until 10. What I had noticed was that on the 3rd Tuesday of every month, a car I didn't recognize, a dark blue Audi, would park at the end of the cul-de-sac for exactly 40 minutes. I noted it the way I note everything. In a small leather journal, dates and times, the kind of record-keeping that becomes instinct when you've done it long enough. The attic conversation happened on a Tuesday. The following Thursday, I was sitting in the small armchair by my French doors reading, when I heard Vanessa's voice from the kitchen. She often made calls in the kitchen in the afternoon when she thought I was napping, which I almost never was. Her voice was low but not quite low enough. The house had good acoustics. I had noticed this too. She was talking about money. Not in generalities, the way people discuss budgets in specifics. Wire. Account number, the third one, not the joint. And then, very clearly, a name. Marcus. I sat very still. She said the word, comfortable, twice. She said the phrase, before Daniel finds out. She laughed once. A short laugh that I'd never heard from her in the 18 months I'd known her. I didn't move from my chair. I sat there for a long time after her voice stopped. Long after I heard the soft sound of the kitchen being tidied, her footsteps in the hall, the click of her office door. I thought about the Audi. I thought about the packages from Net-a-Porter. I thought about a marriage I'd watched for 2 years that felt, now that I examined it with proper attention, less like a partnership and more like a long con with intermittent affection. I thought about my $800,000. I called Frank Delgado the next morning from the back patio, standing among the container plants, keeping my voice even. "Frank," I said, "I need you to pull the gift agreement." He did. He read me the relevant section, which I already knew by heart but needed to hear in his voice. The voice I trusted. Section 7. He said, "Gift reversion. In the event that the recipient fails to honor the terms of occupancy as specified specifically, the donor's right to the ground floor master suite for the duration of his residence, the full value of the gift, $800,000, becomes immediately repayable to the Harmon Family Trust at the donor's election. If repayment cannot be made within 60 days, the donor may place a lien on the property equal to the gift value plus accrued interest at 7% annually." "A lien," I said. "A lien," Frank confirmed, "against a property they still owe $600,000 on. Robert, if you call this in, their equity is gone. They'd have to sell." I looked at a small rosemary plant I'd put in a terracotta pot the week before. Carol always said rosemary was for remembrance. "I don't do anything rashly, Frank," I said. "I need you to have everything prepared. But don't file anything yet." He said he understood. He said what I already knew. The moment Vanessa pushed me to that attic, the clock started. I had the right to invoke the clause. I just needed to know exactly what I was invoking it against, and why. I needed the full picture. The full picture arrived on a Friday, 2 weeks later, when Daniel came home early from a job site and found something I suspect Vanessa had not accounted for. I was in the kitchen when I heard his voice, low and rigid, coming from behind the closed door of their bedroom. I wasn't eavesdropping so much as I was walking to the refrigerator when I heard my name. I stopped. His voice. "What do you mean he needs to move upstairs? We already talked about the attic." "Hers. The attic isn't the issue anymore. I need the ground floor, Daniel, the whole ground floor, both rooms. Both rooms. The suite and the small sitting room adjacent to it, the one I used as a study." His voice again, less certain. "Both, Vanessa. Where is he supposed to go? I don't care where he goes. I need those rooms for the studio. Marcus says if I have the right space, the right setup, we can film 4 videos a week. The revenue share alone would..." "Who is Marcus?" The silence that followed had a texture to it. She said a name. She said the word business. She said the phrase, "You wouldn't understand the industry." And then she said something that I felt travel straight through the wall and land somewhere in the center of my chest. She said, "Daniel, your father's not going to be a problem much longer anyway. I've talked to a real estate attorney. There's nothing in that gift agreement that actually prevents us from selling." I walked back to my suite on very quiet feet. I sat on the edge of the bed. The French doors were open and I could hear a mockingbird in the yard. And I thought about Frank's voice reading Section 7. And I thought about a woman who had just told my son, casually, as though I were a piece of furniture she'd grown tired of, that I would not be a problem much longer. That evening, Daniel came to my door. He looked tired. He sat in the armchair I kept for company, and he told me, without quite looking at me, that he and Vanessa had been thinking, that the arrangement might not be sustainable long-term, that they'd looked into some really lovely senior communities in the area, very active, lots of amenities. He said the word amenities like it was a kindness. I listened to my son describe, in careful, rehearsed language, the process of being discarded. When he finished, I said, "I appreciate you telling me, Daniel. I'm going to need a few days to consider my options." He looked relieved. He said, "Of course, take all the time you need. I used those days well. I am, at my core, a methodical man. Carol used to tease me that I'd have a spreadsheet for my own funeral. I told her she wasn't wrong. The same quality that made me a good accountant made me, it turned out, a patient and thorough investigator of my own circumstances. I called Frank and told him to begin preparing the lien paperwork. I told him to run a title search on the property. He came back to me within 24 hours with something neither of us expected. "Robert," he said, his voice careful in the way it got when something was very wrong. "There's already a lien on this property." I went still. "What kind of lien?" "A home equity line of credit, filed 8 weeks ago. $220,000. He paused. "It's in both their names, but the application was processed through a lender I've never heard of. And the signature notarization is," he paused again, "it's irregular." Irregular. The notary stamp doesn't match any registered notary in Davidson County. "Robert, if Daniel didn't sign this, then someone signed it for him." The silence between us held the full weight of what that meant. "Frank," I said, "how quickly can you have everything ready?" He said, "By end of business tomorrow." I said, "Then I need you to do 2 things simultaneously. File our lien and send a copy of this fraudulent HELOC documentation to the District Attorney's Financial Crimes Division." He said, "Robert," I said, "I know." He said, "This is going to be very hard on Daniel." I said, "It already is. He just doesn't know it yet. I want to tell you what I did next, because people always want to know if I felt guilty. I did. I felt guilty, the way you feel guilty. When you finally take a splinter out of your hand, there's pain, real pain. But underneath it, there's a relief that was always waiting. I packed a bag, not the sad, surrendered bag of a man accepting defeat. I packed with the precision of a man who knew exactly where he was going. 3 weeks earlier, on a quiet afternoon when Vanessa had taken her car somewhere and Daniel was at a job site, I had spent 4 hours on the phone with a real estate agent in Charleston, South Carolina. Carol and I had vacationed there twice in our 30s. She loved the harbor. She loved the way the city smelled of salt water and old roses. I'd thought about it every day since I made the decision to leave. The property was a 3-bedroom carriage house on a cobblestone street, 4 blocks from the water, fully renovated, everything on one level, a small courtyard in the back. Price was listed at $850,000, which was, not coincidentally, almost exactly what I had contributed to a house I was about to walk away from. I had already put in a cash offer. It had already been accepted. On a Wednesday morning, I set my bag by the front door and waited for Daniel to come down for coffee. He found me in the kitchen. He looked at the bag and then at me, and something moved across his face. Not guilt, not yet, but the beginning of the question that would eventually become it. "I'm going to go stay with my college roommate in Savannah for a bit," I told him. "I think you're right. A change of scenery would be good for me. My old roommate, Pete, down in Savannah. I think I'll drive down and visit for a while. Pete lives in Phoenix. He has for 20 years. But Daniel didn't know that. His whole body loosened. He stepped forward and hugged me, the kind of hug that has apology in it even when the person isn't ready to say the word. "Have a safe drive, Dad," he said. "We'll talk soon." I drove south out of Nashville on I-65, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. I was in Charleston by 6 that evening. The agent, a compact, efficient woman named Patricia, met me at the carriage house with the keys. We walked through every room. The floors were original heart pine, warm and solid underfoot. The bathroom had a curbless shower. The courtyard had a fig tree. I stood in the courtyard for a long time. I signed the closing paperwork the next morning. Frank called me at noon. "The lien is filed," he said. "As of this morning, the Harmon Family Trust has a recorded claim against the Brentwood property for $800,000 plus accrued interest. Their existing equity is approximately $380,000. Our lien exceeds it." I sat in my new courtyard in the October sun, and I thought about a number. I thought about $940,000, which is what I got for the Raleigh house. The house where Daniel was born. The house where Carol kept her reading chair. The house I sold to buy into a family that was already dismantling itself. And then Frank said the other thing. "The DA's office has opened an inquiry," he said. "They're looking at the HELOC. They've already sent a letter to the lender requesting the original application documents. Robert, if the signature is forged, if she used his identity, I know what it means, Frank. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want Daniel to know? I said. Send him the lien paperwork through a process server. Let it arrive at the house. Let her see it first. Frank said, That's cold, Robert. I said, She told my son I wouldn't be a problem much longer. I want her to understand what a problem actually looks like. I'm told, from what Daniel later described to me, that the process server arrived on a Thursday afternoon, that Vanessa was in the middle of filming something in my old ground floor suite, the one she had spent exactly 8 days in before I left, when the knock came at the door, that she read the first page of the lien documentation standing in the hallway, and that she said nothing for almost a full minute. That Daniel came home to find her pulling suitcases from the closet. My phone rang at 7:40 that evening. It was Daniel. I answered after the third ring, sitting in my new living room, a glass of sweet tea on the side table next to Carol's small watercolor of the Raleigh dogwoods, the one I'd wrapped carefully and driven down with me. Dad. His voice was a sound I recognized. I had made a sound like it the night Carol died, the sound of the ground disappearing. Daniel, I said, she's gone. She left. He stopped. He started again. She took the Volvo and 2 of the suitcases and she left, Dad. She wouldn't tell me where she was going. And before she left, she said, his voice broke and reformed. She said I should have married someone with more ambition. She said you were the only smart one in the family. I let the silence sit. He told me then, in pieces, that he'd gone through the filing cabinet after she left, that he'd found the HELOC documents, that he'd looked at his own signature on the application and understood, slowly and then all at once, that he had not signed anything of the kind, that he had never signed anything of the kind. Dad, he said, how long did you know? I told him the truth, about the phone calls overheard, about the Audi, about the name Marcus, about the numbers that hadn't added up for longer than either of us were comfortable saying out loud. He was quiet for a very long time. Then, the lien, Dad, the lien on the house. I know, I said. If they can't clear your lien, we'd have to sell. I'd have nothing left after the mortgage pays out. I let him do the math. He was always decent at math, my son. He'd get there. Dad, he finally said, why didn't you tell me? Before you left, why didn't you tell me what you knew? Because you needed to see it yourself, I said. I'm sorry, Daniel. I'm sorry, that's the truth. But you would not have believed me. She had you in a place where my word against hers was not a fair fight. He didn't argue. I think we both knew it was true. He asked where I was. I told him Charleston. He asked if I'd really gone to Savannah. I told him no, I hadn't. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Dad, what happens now? What happens now, I told him, is that I'm going to do something I probably should have done a long time ago. But your mother always said I was too proud for it. I'm going to ask you to come here, to Charleston. Not because everything is fine. It isn't fine. But because you're still my son, and I have a guest room, and we have a lot of work to do. He was there by Saturday evening. He drove 7 hours with a duffel bag and a face that looked like a man who'd walked out of a building that had fallen down around him. He looked thin. He looked young in the way people look young when the armor comes off. He looked like my son. I made dinner. We ate at the small table in the courtyard under the fig tree with real plates, the way Carol always insisted on. We didn't talk much that first night. There was too much between us, and we were both tired of the weight of it. I showed him the guest room, which was on the ground floor, which I want you to note. I had the sense to think about when I bought the property. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me. Dad, he said, I'm sorry I let her talk to you the way she did. I'm sorry I didn't stop it. I'm sorry about the attic. I stood in the doorway. I said what I believed. An apology is the starting point, Daniel, not the destination. He nodded. He seemed to understand the difference. In the weeks that followed, the Brentwood property sold, at Frank's direction, and with the buyer's cooperation. The sale was structured to satisfy the mortgage first, and our lien second. After everything cleared, the Harmon Family Trust recovered $612,000. Not the full $800,000. There were costs. There were losses I'll never get back, including the ones that can't be counted. But enough. Enough to breathe. The DA's office filed charges related to the fraudulent HELOC. Vanessa retained an attorney. I was told she was in California. I had no interest in where she was in California. Marcus, as it turned out, was a man she'd met 18 months earlier, the year before I ever moved to Nashville. The Audi. Her investor, her business partner, her plan. The home equity line had been intended to fund their venture. When it fell apart, and it had been falling apart, the whole enterprise, for months before I ever arrived, she had started looking for other liquidity. The house was the obvious answer, and I, the aging CPA in the ground floor suite, was the obstacle. She had miscalculated, the way dishonest people often do, by underestimating the person she thought was powerless. Daniel got a job in Charleston within 6 weeks. Project management. A smaller firm, but honest work. He paid for his groceries. He did his own laundry. One morning I came into the kitchen early and found him at the table with a yellow legal pad, writing a list. When I asked what it was, he looked up and said, "Things I should have done differently." I sat down across from him. We worked through it together, like father and son, the way I always imagined we might. The fig tree in the courtyard dropped its last fruit of the season on a Sunday. I picked one up from the stones and held it in my palm. Carol had loved figs. She would have loved this courtyard. She would have stood right here and she would have looked at me over the rim of her coffee mug and said, "Robert, you see, it worked out." It worked out, I told the empty courtyard, and the mockingbird that had somehow followed me from Nashville, or one that looked exactly like it, answered from the garden wall. Here is what I know now, at 65, that I wish I had known at 30. Generosity without documentation is not love. It is hope, and hope alone is not a legal instrument. I gave my son $800,000 on a handshake and a family feeling, and I almost lost everything. Not because he was a bad son, but because he had become someone I didn't recognize, someone a woman with sharper edges had slowly carved into shape. The paperwork saved me. Not the money, the paperwork. The clause Frank thought was paranoid. The section Daniel and Vanessa signed without reading. The way people sign things they assume will never matter. They always matter. If someone tells you that asking for documentation from your own family means you don't trust them, I want you to hear this clearly. Documentation is what makes trust possible. It is the foundation the relationship stands on. Without it, you're not building a family arrangement. You're just hoping. I stopped hoping the night I heard her say I wouldn't be a problem much longer. That night, I became an accountant again, and the numbers, as they always do when you look at them honestly, told me exactly what I needed to know. My son is asleep in the room down the hall. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to make coffee, and we are going to sit in the courtyard before he leaves for work, and we are going to be, imperfectly and honestly, a family of 2 people who have earned the right to try again. I think Carol would say, that's enough. I think she'd be right. Tell me in the comments, was I wrong to invoke that clause? Was there another way? And if you've ever felt like the invisible person in a room you paid for, hit the like button, because I see you. Subscribe to Revenge Saga, because I promise you, the clueless old man always has one more move.